We read this morning from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, verses 12 through 22. Now, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, Jesus withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. That is, land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea, across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. From that time, Jesus began to proclaim, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." As Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and Jesus called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A number of years ago, there was a show that was a popular one in our family that we watched together called Deadliest Catch. It was a show, for those of you that may not have seen it, that talked about the profits and the perils of working on crab fishing boats in the stormy waters off of Alaska's Bering Sea. The children enjoy watching it because it was full of adventure and excitement. Mom and Dad watched it because it was a weekly reminder that even though our jobs sometimes seemed like they were difficult and challenging, and we might have been reluctant to face going to work the next day after watching The Deadliest Catch, we always had the same sense, which was there are worse jobs out there. And in fact, fishing for crab in the Bering Sea is a very demanding job, one that's quite dangerous and is done in fairly disagreeable weather. Those men, and I believe there's one or two women that do that, they are working night and day, throwing 700-pound crab pots into the ocean and then having to haul them back out again. And all the while they are trying to do this on an iced-over, wet surface on a boat while there's gale force winds that are whipping across, that moving the equipment and the machinery in front of them and threatening to knock them off into the ocean, and occasionally there'll be a rogue wave that sweeps over the deck. The death rate for people in that industry during the season averages nearly one a week. The injury rate is virtually 100% for people doing that work. The only upside, apparently, is the financial one. Those who risk their lives so that we can enjoy king crab and snow crab is that they get paid a boatload of money. Jesus' first disciples, as we read in our text for today, these first men that he called to follow him were fishermen. Andrew and Peter, John and James were fishermen. They fished near their home on the shores and in the Sea of Galilee. And they fished for a variety of fish. These are the things that you learn in seminary. Is they fished for sardines and for carp and for a form of tropical warm water fish called mushed, which is apparently quite tasty. Have never verified that. The Galilean fishermen didn't have to contend with some of the same things that the fellows who fish in the Bering Sea have to contend with. No snow and ice, but because the Sea of Galilee is relatively shallow and subject to rapid temperature changes and wind and sea, it can cause storms to sweep across the sea quite quickly. And we know, don't we, that that happened on at least one occasion because we have a story about how a storm came up quickly and Jesus calmed the storm. The Galilean fishermen of Jesus' day also didn't have to contend with all of that heavy machinery that was threatening to knock them over, to either smash them or to impale them or to push them into the drink. Their fishing was not nearly as hazardous as the crab fishermen in the Bering Sea, but probably not as lucrative either, at least not enough for these early disciples to stick with fishing for sardines when they were called to be fishers of men and women. Jesus' disciples immediately drop their nets and follow after Jesus. And so we read in verse 18, as Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. The number of references and metaphors, imagery that Jesus uses in his teaching, and the number of disciples who he called who were fishermen, has given us something perhaps of a sense of outsized importance to fishing in that culture. But in fact, fishing was a very small industry, very localized around the Sea of Galilee. So it could have been just that because Jesus grew up in that area and happened to know some of these fellows, that he called them as his first disciples, and that he used fishing as a metaphor or in his teaching, in his parables. But there really are some good reasons that Jesus would have intentionally selected fishermen to be his first disciples and to use that as a metaphor in his teaching. They were very hard workers, just like the fellows on the Bering Strait. They fished night and day during the season, difficult job, physically demanding job, year-round. They were very skilled. The descriptions that we have of what it took in a day before there were synthetic materials to create the kind of nets and the variety of nets that they used required a level of practice to a craft, a level of skill and attention to that, of patience. There was descriptions of the kind of linen that had to be rolled and woven together, and every time it used, it has to be dried out because otherwise it's going to rot and disintegrate. This is something that requires some dedication to that craft. Likewise, the different kinds of fish that they were fishing for required different implements, required different things for them to use, like we talked with the children. Sometimes it required a net for smaller fish like the sardines, or a rod with a hook, or even in some cases the use of a small sharp harpoon-like instrument to fish. Required some awareness of when and what, under what conditions, for what purpose they were fishing. Did require also that they have some means. These are people that have capital. They have boats and nets. There's a reference with the Zebedee family that the hired hands are there with them. And we know this to be the case because we know what Mrs. Zebedee does in the future is that she becomes a disciple herself. This is a family that's able to let go of several family members to support Jesus' ministry and continue to maintain their family business during the time that Jesus was active in his ministry. And so Jesus says to these people that he has selected to be his first disciples These men who have the kind of work ethic and the kind of skill and the ability to contextualize and apply their skills and the ability and the commitment to follow after them. He says to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." So it makes sense then, if Jesus was looking for a particular kind of disciple, he would find one there, the kind of people that had carefully practiced skills, different kinds of techniques, and the willingness to commit to being his follower. So if we think about it, Jesus wasn't asking people who didn't have any options. Yeah, there were many people who followed after him in the crowds and were taught and healed, but he surrounded himself with people who made a commitment. They had options and alternatives, and they gave up things. And that engenders a kind of connection and commitment to a cause that he was also looking for. Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Jesus doesn't offer any details about what lies ahead in Andrew and Peter, James and John. They don't ask. Jesus doesn't make any kind of promises about the success that they might be expecting or not. And these first disciples don't hesitate. They just drop their nets and they follow after him. Same thing with the calling of John and James. Verse 21, as Jesus went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in their boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. And he called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Now, the leaving here was not just leaving the boat, not just leaving their father. They left all that they knew, all that they might have expected for themselves, for their future, all that might have been expected of them by their families or by their culture. They walked away from a lot in order to follow after Jesus. And their families gave up a lot. The text is silent here on what Mr. Zebedee's thoughts were. Imagine what his reaction to this is as his two adult sons, who are presumably a main part of this fishing business, say, "We're going." And no comment from Mrs. Zebedee when she finds out, "What do you mean John and James left today with Jesus?" That's what we are still called to do today. That's the kind of call on our lives that Jesus makes of us. We are still called, you and I, all of us, called to drop our nets, to be fishers of men and women instead of whatever it is that our chosen profession or the skills and the gifts that we have developed for our own plans for our lives. Called to leave that behind, all the expectations that we might have had, all the expectations that our families might have had for us. Called to be followers of Jesus, to be fishers of women and men. Called to work hard, just like Jesus' disciples. Called to use our skills and our giftedness, whether they're ones that we have developed for a secular purpose or ones that have been spiritual gifts that God has equipped us with in order to do what he's called us to do when he calls us out of our lives. To use our abilities, to look at what context we are in, to look at the kind of people that we are fishing for, and to realize that maybe a net's not the right thing in one case. Maybe a harpoon is too much in another. Called to make the same kind of commitment that these first disciples were called to make. To say, yeah, I do have other choices. I have other options And yet I'm willing to let those go because the call on my life from Jesus requires that I do so. All of us called to be disciples, not just if we have been called to a particular form of service that is one that is in the church, but all of us called to be disciples. Now, there are some misconceptions that we labor under, some things that we don't get quite right when it comes to this call on our lives. And they're almost exactly opposite misconceptions. On one hand, we tend to think that our role in this is more important than it really is. We get ourselves all wrapped around this idea that it's all up to us, it's all up to me, it's all up to you. We got to have all the answers that everyone we talk to could possibly want an answer to, and we're responsible somehow for every person that we talk to have a changed heart or a changed mind. And when you start thinking along those terms in that kind of narrative, it gets overwhelming and you shut down and you don't do anything at all because it's just too much. That's one thing, but we don't have to have all the answers. That's not part of the job. Jesus has the answers. Jesus is the answer. And it's the Holy Spirit that changes minds and hearts, that transforms lives. That's way above our pay grade on this. You think about the fellows that fish for crab in Alaska. Their job, go to where the fish are, throw a net or a crab pot, in their case, into the ocean, come back, pull it back up, and give it to the people who are going to ship it to the lower 48, to the restaurants and the processors, and to the people who are going to prepare the food in the restaurants for us to eat. Their job is to be fishermen, not to be shippers and chefs. Our job as Christians is to be fishers. Go where the people are. Love Jesus and go hang out with sinners. That's our job. We're not called to be shippers and chefs. Now, on the other hand, other extreme, is we tend to view our role as being less important than it really is in this sense, which is that we make it less of a priority because it's less of a priority to us, right? Except that it is the most important priority to the people that we are called to go fish. It's important to the people that we are called to reach, even if we tend to think it's not important, it's less of a priority, I don't need to get around to that today. I've been in churches where people have fought about the fabric that was going to be used to reupholster the pews, the cushions in the pews. My response on this is that there are people who are dying to sit where you are sitting right now. There's a quote from a famous atheist. He's part of the Penn and Teller magic team from Penn Jillette. And he was quoted one time, in a quote that kind of went viral, to say, how much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize? To keep that to yourself, to not make the effort to share what you think and believe is the most important news that you can share with someone. How much do you have to hate them to not share that? It's a really disturbing way of looking at making this be more of a priority in our lives and in our churches. We got to make fishing be a priority. It's what we're called to do. It needs to be a priority in our church. So what does that look like? What does that look like if we were to make that be a priority? And here's the shameless plug for the mission study focus groups. That's a time when we as a family of faith, the body of Christ here in this place and for this time, looking for the next pastor, can come together and do what we call cast vision. It's an interesting use of the term. We cast for vision on what that's going to look like for the future. For us to come together and say, 10 years ago, 25 years ago, 50 years ago, we kind of had an idea of what it looked like to go out fishing. We knew what we needed to take with us to go fishing. And in many cases, didn't have to do anything. We just wait and the fish jumped in. That's not true anymore. And so we have an opportunity to come together and say, what is that going to look like for us moving forward in this community for us now today? Not a year ago, not 10 years ago, but now and next year and maybe even a few years after that. And that's the end of the plug. We have room in our church. We've got room in our church. And by the way, the fabric on the cushions in the pews is perfect. We don't need to change that. There are people that we may already know, certainly people we don't know, just within a mile of our church here, that are looking for something. We talked last week about come and see and what it is that people are looking for, what we're all looking for, hope and comfort and peace and meaning in our lives and answers to the eternal questions that we can never find the answers for, but in a saving relationship with Jesus. And our job is to say, hey, here's Jesus. Point to Jesus. Love Jesus, hang out with sinners. Say, here's the answer. Tell these people where they can find the bread that will fill them, the living waters that will give them relief from their thirst and satisfy their thirst. The address of where they can find Jesus.